Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our first Women Get on Board speaker series for 2025. I want to begin today by acknowledging the land in which I live is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. The Upper Canada Treaties cover this territory and are within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon, the Wampum Agreement, and are directly adjacent to the Haldeman Treaty territory. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous people, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to enjoy the natural surroundings of this territory. I encourage all of us to become actively involved in understanding why land acknowledgements are essential and understanding Indigenous histories and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada. Welcome. I'm Deborah Rosati, founder and CEO of Women Get on Board. We are a member-based company that connects and promotes women to corporate boards. We have over 1,000 members across Canada with diversity in our membership. Our goal is to get more women on boards. Women Get on Board is delighted to host this virtual event today with our sponsor, Southlea Group. So without further ado, if you could move the slides, please. I am going to turn over the session to Amanda Voegeli. She is President and Managing Partner at Southlea Group. Welcome, Amanda, and over to you.
Thanks, Deborah. We're pleased to be here, as always, partnering with Women Get on Board. So as HRC members, we are responsible for the important processes around organizations where we are focused on attracting, retaining, and motivating the human talent that drive any organization and then drive the strategy. So why is it so important that this committee be effective? And why is it so hard? Is it because we're navigating the complexities of aligning the best pay for performance package? Or is it because we're tackling the most sensitive issue, which is pay, near and dear to everyone's heart? Or maybe it's because when you make these decisions, you really do need to collaborate. I would argue among the Human Resources Committee, collaborate more than potentially any other committee, because you have to navigate the emotions and the perspectives of a CEO, of a Chief Human Resources Officer, each individual committee member, and then the board. So lots of sensitive issues with lots of important considerations. And finally, don't forget that while we're talking a lot about, many boards and committees talk a lot about compensation, we have to remember that we're also driving cultural change, and we're driving the organizational structure that is executing on the talent strategies. So our goal today is to provide you insights, tools, and strategies to face these challenges with clarity and confidence. So today we're going to be talking about these three major categories. So we're talking about building an effective human resources committee. We're going to share some stories around creating effective meetings. We go to enough meetings in any given year that we're hoping that we can share some of our favorite tips and tricks. And supporting the broader scope of the Human Resources Committee. It's been evolving for quite some time now, and so we thought we'd share a little bit more with you about what does that actually mean from a Human Resources Committee perspective. So as Deborah mentioned, and as you've seen in the advertising, this is part one of a part two series. The second series that we hope you'll also join is on June, 18th. And it is the second document that Southlea Group has created. It is a two-part series that we had developed. This toolkit for human resources, it is free. It is on our website. We did develop it with the Institute of Corporate Directors. And you can go to www.southlea.com into our intellectual capital sections and download the slides, because today we're going to have more of a conversation. But if you'd like to sort of flip through some more slide type education, you could do that there. So on the next slide, we wanted to just highlight, for those of you who don't already know us, Southlea Group is one of the largest leading exec comp and governance services provider. We were founded by 4 senior partners, formerly of Willis Towers Watson, and we built a new company to provide a differentiated experience. We provide insights, not just data. We have the ability to create more robust analytical capabilities. We can customize, and we're specific on our expertise in terms of our compensation design and related governance advisory, including ongoing management and oversight of the Human Resources Committee. The one thing you'll notice about us is that we're direct and we're consultative. It means that we're going to give you our advice. You don't always have to take it, but we hope that you do. And finally, I'd mention that we are global. We're able to provide global insights, even though we are local here in Canada. And the reason we're able to do that is through our affiliation with the GECN Global Executive Compensation Network, which allows us to access six jurisdictions and 150 consultants around the world. So today you're joined by 3/4 of the founding partners, and we're here to present and share with you. All of us have between 15 and almost 30 years of experience advising Canada's leading boardrooms. And we thought we would just share some stories and tips and tricks that we've learned along the way. I'm here with Ryan and Alex, who also share their experience. So finally, as I was said, I'm Amanda. I'm the managing partner of Southlea Group, and I do really love my job because I get to share my years of experience in and day out, and I get to use those insights to solve new and different business challenges through talent programs every day. So let's jump into it in terms of building an effective human resources committee. So most people think that all mandates for a human resources committee are the same. You might think that they're designed to have the exact same oversight across organizations. At Southlea Group, we spend a lot of time actually reviewing mandates. We do review them annually. You'll note if you've been on a few committees or on boards that it's actually part of the HRC mandate to review the mandate every year, which sort of might sound a little bit overkill. But it's not, because you'd be surprised again at how many discussion items that Southlea Group comes up with when we do our own review of the mandates. The actual oversight and accountability of human resources committees do vary. And really what you have to think about is like the broad brush statements of what we oversee are similar in terms of programs and pay levels. But it's where the actual approval falls is quite different in different organizations at the Human Resources Committee or at the board level. So the Human Resources Committee doing the hard work to decide what's right and then recommending to the board for actual approval, or is the actual approval at the Human Resources Committee? It's an important distinction that you understand when you're on a Human Resources Committee, where does the buck fall? And it does vary. One rule of thumb I would give you is that for CEOs, I think many of you know this, but CEO pay and performance is always a board activity. However, it is overseen by the Human Resources Committee, meaning all the heavy lifting of performance reviews or looking at pay data and alignment of pay and performance starts with the Human Resources Committee, and then the more robust conversation with the recommendations of the Human Resources Committee would be done at the board level. The other asterisk I'd put on sort of obviously goes to the board would be anything to do with equity if you're a publicly traded company, and that's more of a securities regulation. Otherwise, the world is a little bit your oyster, so it does have a lot to do with the maturity of the organization, the type of the type of oversight in the other committees that you have. So you want some consistency of what would reside at a committee level and what would reside at a board level. So it depends on, the level of maturity of the organization and the governance model of these other committees. The next important thing to do is once you've really digested what you're responsible for reviewing, approving, or recommending to the board, those are the three sort of levels of work for each item, then you'd want to see how this translates into the work schedules and agendas. So where do you see each item? How often do you get to see these the content related to your responsibilities? And which part of the agenda does it fall in? Is there enough time being spent on the right activities? So one of the tips we have, and we've got sort of some templates that in fact are in our release that you can get off the website, it sort of shows you more of a Gantt chart, which is got sort of in more painstaking detail, what are the responsibilities and what are the roles and oversight for the board, the chair of the committee itself, advisors, and the Chief Human Resources Officer, as an example. So you might want to, so then we were covering off, you got to make sure that you have the right people around the table when you're making this decision, which again might sound quite straightforward. And many of you have heard of the concept of a skills matrix. This is actually, skills matrix comes from public companies, whereby it's actually even reported in the public disclosures of public companies, which skills do we need and who do we have, and sort of tick the box as to which director has which skill that the board needs. It's a nice way to take a step back and say, overall, we have the right people with the right skills, even though not everyone has the same skills. It's a great idea, but one thing we would note is that you may need to go a little bit deeper on the Human Resources Committee experience and expertise when we see the current issues that come to the meetings. You might just, you can't just have someone say that they've done human resources before or compensation before, because frankly, everyone likes to tick that box because they've been paid and because they've overseen someone. So we do need to sort of see exactly what is that. And I would encourage, because of, when we get to Ryan's section on the next generation of Human Resources Committee, we'd encourage that you look for culture expertise as well as talent development expertise, because as you'll see, these are the areas where we can actually acknowledge that the committees that have those skills really can have deeper conversations and can actually make a difference with the guidance that they give the organization. The last thing I'll say is that the other important part, especially I would argue of Human Resources Committee, is that you have overlap across the committees. And in particular, we see that in our development of executive scorecards or performance scorecards that relate to incentive plans, as an example. And as you can imagine, we determine what the important criteria are for performance, and then we set targets. We set thresholds, we set targets, we set maximums that are aligned with most of the bonus programs out there. As an example, these performance parameters might be also overseen in different committees. An obvious one would be the safety. So any kind of organization where safety is a priority, you also have a safety committee, which surely those people overseeing how to measure it, how is the organization doing, should have a say on how that overlaps into an incentive plan. This is why it makes sense that someone from the safety committee also sits on the HRC. All that important work and discussion that's happening in a separate environment, the safety committee environment, needs to somehow get transported into the Human Resources Committee. And you can think about that also as it relates to budget setting and financial objectives within the audit committee, perhaps, and others. So it's very important that you have individuals represented across the committees on the Human Resources Committee, as an example.
So Amanda, I think that was a great sort of overview in terms of the matrix and the mandate. And it's interesting as we reflect upon it, and you would think on the surface, as you sort of talked about it, that the mandate would be sort of straightforward or consistent. And it's one of those areas, though, that you really have to get into the details, right? Like it's one of those areas where you do have to sort of go line by line and think of almost every different circumstance that could come up and how to deal with it, because you want to sort of do all of that in advance, right? Like you don't want to then, it's too late if all of a sudden you just kind of keep doing the same thing year in, year out, and then all of a sudden management makes a decision to hire someone and offer them a huge pay package or pay out a big severance, and then they go, well, we don't have to report that to the committee, or we don't need to get the committee to approve it. And then the committee's going, well, no. Like we should be like this is material that's important. We should be understanding it. So I do think like it's an interesting thought process that, that responsibility matrix and articulating those responsibilities does get quite granular, because it's not only, reviewing exec comp levels, it is, what is the role if you were to make a new hire? Do all new hire contracts have to go to the committee? Do they review it? Do they have to approve it? Is it just on an exception base? Like there's just a lot of nuance.
Well, exactly. And I find we could share that across our committee mandates, it's clear, it's important you articulate whom of the executive is the oversight of the HRC
Right.
and the board. And as I said, CEO is obvious, but there's different ways to say the next level of management. Is it the CEO and the direct reports? Is it the CEO and direct reports who are also officers? Is it a depending on the size and nature of the organization, is it something a little bit broader? Is it the highest paid individuals? You know, asset management companies, people make over $1 million. There is a responsibility, even though they're not executives and even though they may not even be officers, to have some line of sight of very significant pay packages. So again, like Ryan, you just said, it's nuanced, but if you have individuals making that kind of money, it's important it says it in the mandate that it
Right.
is the oversight of the committee. If it doesn't say it in the mandate, then it isn't your responsibility. So
Right.
having reviewed it very closely, fine-tooth comb, what are we doing and what are we not doing, is incredibly important to understanding your responsibilities.
Yeah, and kind of differ a little bit in terms of that. For the CEO and direct reports, the role is X, but for the next level down, we review it in aggregate, or we review the exceptions, or right, like there's different ways of articulating it through the organization. So it's not necessarily suggesting that line by line, those details need to be shared with the committee, but they need to be seen at the right level so that they can effectively oversee and ask questions if needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're going to talk about this later a bit more about how oversight has evolved. And remember, there's very few rules here. Like there are some rules in securities and corporate
Right.
law, but not a lot of rules about how this is implemented. So when you are the chair of the HRC, you just want to make sure that you are comfortable with the level of oversight and that you're seeing it. Your point is well taken about the inconsistency across organizations about pre-approving big pay packages and or pre-approving terminations. I think that's one that if someone were to ask us how common it is, it's not, 100% common, but is it a best practice? Probably, right? A best practice for at the most senior levels. You probably should be asking for some oversight of something that important.
Right. Yeah, and it also, I guess, then, you also talked just a little bit about, in some cases, do you need to come to the meeting multiple times? So it's not just sort of a one meeting thing. In some cases, it could be to review at one meeting and make a decision at a subsequent meeting. But then that also then raises questions, how many meetings should we have per year, right? And so I do think, though, that we are starting to see that, 4 is a more typical sort of number, whereas historically, legacy, I think, was, you probably could do 3 per year, but increasingly we're seeing more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think that the items on the agendas are getting mixed around. Like historically, the compensation discussions were being had in December, like fourth quarter
Right.
and first quarter, closing off a year and starting a new
Right.
year, and comp, 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 comp. But I think we would share that and the summer meetings were about talent. And so what we're sort of seeing and encouraging is a little bit more overlap between the talent conversations and the pay conversations. So they're not so discrete. And any of you that sit on committees will appreciate that comment because there's hardly any conversation about compensation when you're talking about talent and where you're
Right.
moving people around and what is their development objectives. But for obvious reasons, we do think that having those things more integrated makes more sense.
Perfect. Well, and I think that gives a good segue now over to Alex to talk more specifically around how we think about meetings.
Perfect. So thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Amanda. That was a good foundation. I'm going to walk through. So now we have the roadmap because we've looked at the mandate. We have the committee calendar. So there would be rough agendas set for the course of the year. Now I'll frame how you can actually create and run an effective HRC meeting. It does beg the question, what do we mean by effective? So as I reflect on the last 15 years of sitting in committee meetings, there's a few examples that stand out of meetings that were not effective. Maybe I can share some of those stories. Things that come to mind, it was meetings where there was a lot of emotion or frustration but among the committee members or between committee and management where you couldn't find consensus on topics. It would have been meetings where the committee members felt rushed to make a decision, whether the materials were arriving late or they were receiving information for review, and at the same meeting they were asked for approval. So that often doesn't support a good discussion. It was meetings where there was new information brought to the committee. So even though there might have been a pre-review socialization process in the meeting, there was new information shared which caught members by surprise, which then all of a sudden that was very disruptive. And then another example was where there wasn't that time to collect socialization or collect perspectives ahead of time. So everybody was flying blind in the meeting. Those were not fun. On the other hand, on the other extreme, meetings where it just felt like it was a rubber stamp, where there wasn't discussion and debate, those were also not effective. We'll talk a little bit about the pre-meeting process, which is very important. But if those discussions ahead of the meeting are used to make decisions, and you're not actually using the meeting time effectively, that's not good either. So even though that might sound efficient, it doesn't give the chance for committee members and management to engage in discussion, to have healthy debate, to collaborate, as you mentioned. So with that as an outline of what not to do, some of the tips and tricks of running an effective meeting, I can share some, but welcome, Amanda, welcome your thoughts as well. So one would be a clear agenda, which I know sounds fundamental, but there's some tricks you can do in terms of course, laying out the meeting topic, but really thinking through the time frame upon which you're going to allocate time for that topic, which is going to be influenced by, is it for review and discussion versus approval? Has it been brought to prior meetings in the past, which would then influence the amount of time you're putting on that agenda item? The meetings that were really effective is when committee members are really engaged. The only way that committee members can be engaged is if they have materials ahead of time. You need to give them time to think about the topic and reflect on what their perspective is. And it gives, if there is a question that they want to raise ahead of time, or they want to ask for more analysis ahead of time, they need to have that opportunity.
Well, and adding to
yeah.
that, Alex, I would say having clear material with executive summaries make a meeting go smoothly. That in itself, we've sort of witnessed, where if it's not clear, if there isn't a summary, that the material itself can derail a conversation or derail a meeting. And it sort of sounds obvious. And I think everyone wants to be nice to everyone. And so sometimes the hard feedback is not given. But it actually is really critical to ensuring that a meeting goes well.
Yeah, I think sometimes there's this view that more information is better, but it's actually volume is not your friend. You can have some appendices which give additional supporting analysis, but upfront it's the 1 to 2 page outline of, here are the key discussion topics, here's the rationale for the recommendation made. No spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are not good to share with committee members.
And now going back to your agenda point, I think the other item that not everyone always knows about is a consent agenda. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, these are the contents, these are how many minutes we're spending on each discussion. Here's your job. You're either reviewing it, you're approving it, or you're recommending it. A lot of clarity there on an agenda. But maybe talk a little bit about your experience of what's best practice of what to put in a consent agenda, Alex.
Yeah, for those that don't know, what do we mean by consent agenda? It's a section within the agenda where you're including materials that are expected as pre-read only. Now, of course, if there were questions or things that people wanted to raise concerns with, they of course can, but ultimately it's a section within the agenda that, unless there's questions, it's assumed that the materials are read and that the committee members either agree with it or support it, or that it was just for context and not for discussion. So examples might be where you've been reviewing plan document materials and they've already come to the committee a couple times. And so now it's on the agenda just to review the black line and reflect the changes that were already made and approved. That's an easy consent agenda item, because unless there's more questions or debate, it's agreed upon. Another would be, again, an update to, sometimes we do risk assessments and you might have already completed the full risk review, but this is just providing an update or additional analysis from the last meeting that was requested. Again, we don't need to spend a lot of time on the agenda, so it's incorporated into the pre-read.
And I would also say that the way you handle that agenda item as a chair of a Human Resources Committee is you do have to pause and as much as Alex just said, it's assumed that there are no questions and that there shouldn't be debate. The question is, does anyone have any questions about the consent agenda? So you do give a minute of time in the case that there is something in there that someone is uncomfortable with. So it doesn't mean that you don't have an opportunity to pull it back up if you need to, if there's something in there that concerns you. But otherwise, usually it goes very, very swimmingly and allows for there to be good oversight, but not waste minutes of the precious meeting time.
Yeah, and going back to your suggestion of executive summaries. So there's sort of two ways to think about that. There's the executive summary related to a specific topic. So that helps to frame what the discussion will be on a certain agenda item. There's another way that we've started to see executive summaries used, which is a memo that can be shared. In some cases, it's from the CHRO to the committee to say, here are, over the course of a page, here are the 7 or 8 agenda topics. Here's what we're asking of you for discussion or for approval. And here's a very quick summary. So it sort of sets the tone for the contents of the meeting. That's one approach. Another approach we've seen is where the committee chair is sending a note to the other committee members to flag, here are the areas where I think there's some sensitivity, or here's some areas where we definitely want to get your feedback, committee members. They're not trying to influence decisions or perspectives in that email or memo, but they are trying to shape, here's where we need to prioritize time and collect feedback.
And I guess the other place that comes into play is the in cameras, because as you're saying, there's an opportunity to, we often see, and as I'd say a best practice, that in the agenda again, it's actually that you have to designate time for these in cameras. So we're seeing that quite effective, a short in camera up front, and then, you know, however long is needed at the back end. But we do say short up front for the first in camera. So that means without management representatives in the room, you can have your advisors or additional resources in the room with you to do the upfront. But it is more like what Alex said. It's like, it's not meant to have a conversation or definitely not to make any decisions in depth at all. The point is more to clarify something, or if there's a point where the agenda item, you just need to give a heads up of what's going to happen, or maybe some information you've received prior to coming into the room that needs to be shared with everyone. And then the final one, of course, the in-camera at the end, once you've downloaded all the information, you've had the experts and the presentations, is an opportunity for you to have a really open discussion and dialogue before making some of your more final sensitive decisions.
Yeah, I guess the final suggestion, reflecting on experience with these things, is that for each topic, it truly is a concise overview. It's the 1 to 2 minute framing of the topic and then opening up for Q&A. Again, assuming that the materials are helpful and assuming that they're pre-reviewed, that the overview is framing the discussion, and then it's intended to collect committee feedback. There's many times where it's a 10-minute topic, but 8 of those minutes is presentation, and it doesn't allow for the time to actually get into debate and discussion.
And one thing we forgot to mention is, you know, with all these technologies that support committees are so fantastic, actually. I mean, it's not fantastic so you can insert 300 pages here, but what we also see as effective is sometimes a summary snapshot of the programs. We all forget the details. They are not intended to be, you know, repetitive throughout the agenda, but for information is sort of what most of our clients call it. There's a separate tab in these diligent packages where for information is long-standing details of programs, like a snapshot of what is the executive compensation program can often go in there so that we can whoever needs to can go quickly to that area without emailing someone or calling someone, and just sort of get the tidbits that you need to, the critical information about how a program works or what are the key measures. That should be at people's fingertips, and it would be in that other section of the technology that you're using.
So if we
Okay,
move
so
to the last section, then we've talked a lot about internal look around the HR committee itself and how meetings operate. But what's interesting, I think, around executive compensation and HR committees on the next slide is around there's no shortage of opinions around executive pay. And so you operate in a different space where there's a ton of stakeholders and a ton of different perspectives. And so as you consider the role of the HR committee, you consider sort of how you approach decisions through the year. We have to sort of keep in mind that these governance stakeholders have different perspectives, and those different perspectives can evolve over time. And so continually monitoring and tracking and updating the charter is required, because these things do evolve over time. Many organizations, to differing degrees, have to make disclosure around executive pay. So the decisions that you're making don't just remain internal to the committee. They do have either repercussions internally as part of internal communication, or externally through different forms of disclosure. And so we need to sort of keep that in mind as we think about how decisions get made. And then there's also moving beyond just how do we establish target pay levels and incentive design. It's making sure that we have a good understanding of pay outcomes. We have a good understanding of the governance of compensation programs. So Alex talked about compensation risk assessments. There's other governance tools that we need to be thinking about regularly in terms of share ownership policies, clawback provisions, contractual termination provisions. There's a bunch of broader sort of issues associated with compensation that as an HR committee we can't lose sight of. And then finally, there's this idea that we're not talking about a compensation committee anymore. We're talking about a human resource committee. And so how do we now start to extend the conversation beyond talking about compensation and performance to these broader talent and cultural issues? And this has been an evolution now for a number of years, and organizations are at different sort of paths in terms of the journey. But it is thinking through a little bit as like the role of the board. How do we continue to oversee what's happening within the organization? We don't want to necessarily stick our fingers in and get into the specifics around how these programs are designed, but we want to be able to understand that we have programs, that they're effective, that they're getting to the right outcomes, that we're asking the right questions of management to understand sort of the effectiveness of these programs through the organization, and talking about things around talent more broadly. So not just talking about, do we have CEO succession? What does the succession look like for our executive team? And as we go down in the organization, at a more aggregate level, what is the bench strength within our organization in terms of the percentage of roles that have strong successors in place, or that we're making progress in terms of diversity, that we're making progress in terms of our culture or engagement. And so there's a lot of questions that can be asked, and that's why this idea of a talent dashboard can be quite helpful as you think about it. So it's looking at what are all of the metrics that we should be thinking through, and these are things that HR regularly collect anyway. So you can be monitoring turnover levels. You can be looking at how quickly does it take us to hire employees. What do promotions look like through the organization? We can put a diversity lens on that to identify if there's any risks in the organization, if we have certain genders or certain diversity profiles that are more likely to leave the organization or less likely to get promoted. So if you have these dashboards in front of you, you are able to, as an HR committee, start to see trends and start to identify areas where do we need to ask questions of management to better understand what programs do we have in place in order to mitigate potential risks or to address potential trends within our talent profile. So it's an expanding area, and so you'll start to see, I think, over time, more and more discussions on. And then to Amanda's point, how do we connect not only talent and culture to performance and pay? It becomes a much more sort of integrated discussion overall.
We actually have a bunch of comments as it relates to this, Ryan. I don't know if you've seen in the chat, but I feel like a lot of the comments and chat that we have here has to do with the broader role. Actually, that's what people are interested in. And in particular, they're interested in how the oversight of culture and talent, like maybe either of you could share an example or story about someone that does it particularly well, or something in terms of what you see at the board level. And the other note that's related was about oversight of technology and the use of AI as an example in terms of a tool that the talent is using.
So, I mean, I
Yeah.
think like, or
Okay.
Alex, go ahead.
Well, I was going to jump in that what comes to mind is oftentimes because traditionally the compensation committee was focused on compensation, that would ensure that there's alignment of goals and that people are attracted and retained through pay programs. But what's interesting about culture is you could have the greatest pay programs, but that can be overshadowed by a poor culture, a culture that doesn't align with the strategy, the business strategy, or the HR strategy, or it doesn't engage employees. And in that case, you have to sort of overcome that poor culture with compensation programs, which goes back to what Ryan was saying. These things have to be integrated as part of an employee value proposition, with total rewards being one element, but culture and manager effectiveness and leadership are all things that will influence a productive company.
I would just add that the culture comes from the top. So I don't think that it's, if people look for like surveys are great, surveys should be done, you'll get some insights. I would say that what we would have experienced as like live interaction, even as external advisors, is get to know your management team, because they are the ones that are leading the culture, and they are the ones, what is culture? It is the way people act, it's the way they behave, it's the way they speak to people. That is all it is. So I do think that knowing how people feel about the leaders, knowing how you feel about the leaders, like really getting to know who they are and what they're saying and how they're behaving is a critical part of the HRC. You don't have to be overseeing it all the way down to the receptionist, like you will through the surveys, but your job as interacting with the leadership of the organization is where you can make a difference. You'll know when you have someone in the mix that is making the wrong choices.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan,
But
to
I
your
do
point,
think that you do though then need to go, I think, one level down below that, right? I fully agree with you, Amanda, in terms of culture at the top, that the leadership team, even in how they present materials, share information, can tell you a lot about how decisions get made within the organization. But I do think having that broader lens around what's happening as you go into the organization, either through a survey, which is one tool, and understanding how things are perhaps different, not just in aggregate, but how things differ by executive member or within different parts of the organization is important. And the talent dashboard, and just understanding what are the metrics, because again, you can't hide behind the data. And so if you are seeing consistent trending in certain areas, that over time we're losing our high, we've identified, high potential critical skill staff, and those are the ones that are more likely to leave, then there is an issue there. And so I do think having the data when you're sitting there at the board level can sort of help you understand sort of what's happening, throughout the organization. And Alex, you were gonna.
well, I was going to ask you, Ryan, because to your point about these are evolving areas and we're seeing the expansion of HR mandates. How would a board prepare for this? If these are new topics as part of the agenda, how can a board member be confident and up to speed on these topics?
Well, I think you have to just step into it, right? Like, I think it's something where you're not going to be able to do all of this at once. I think it's something that you need to sort of partner with the CHRO and the CEO to sort of understand sort of what are we trying to achieve, what information is available. It's going to, right? Every organization is going to have a different level of sophistication in terms of readiness around this. So I don't think it's like a one size, like this is the standard approach that's going to work in every organization. I think it's something that you do need to figure out, and in partnership, to Amanda's point around collaboration, this is one where you can collaborate more and ask questions and develop sort of the roadmap in terms of over time, how do we evolve this? So it makes sense for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. And we haven't said this, but anyone who is an HRC chair will feel that the pressure is even greater for that person on all of these ideas that we've shared today. And we're going to answer some questions, but we do believe it's important. The reason why we have this as a toolkit and have done the work we've done is because Southlea does believe it's important that you take a really detailed view of your mandate and your role, the responsibilities, take a hard look at those agendas to make sure that they're organized in a way that help you feel like you are satisfying your responsibilities. Take a look at who's sitting around the table and make some changes if you don't think you have the right experience contributing to those discussions. So today we hope that you have learned a few tips and tricks and that you've got some ideas on some feedback perhaps that you'll take to your next HRC on how to make the meetings run a little bit smoother, get access to the information that you need in order to make confident decisions within the Human Resources Committee. Deborah, questions? And I know there's some in chat we didn't cover off yet, but.
Okay, thank you. Wow, great tips, tricks, and I love the stories. I think that's what's really compelling. And I know, Amanda, you captured a couple that of the questions, but there's quite a few in the chat. So, which is always great to see the engagement in the discussion. So first question up is, can you talk about balancing the role of HRC in this hiring comp issue versus overstepping into the CEO's operations, particularly on a not-for-profit? I don't know who wants to take that one, or do you want me to repeat it?
Well,
No.
I think it's, I mean, I would just say a couple things and then Amanda jump in. I think one is if there's clarity around what the underlying compensation philosophy and framework and structure is, and this is a hire or a termination that's in line with what's already been agreed to and is already aligned with standard agreements, then maybe those types of cases don't always have to go for an approval. It might just be more for information, at least it's shared with the HR committee so that they understand. I think it's when there's exceptions or if there's not clarity and there's a lot of customized or one-off deals between executives, that's, I think, where the HR committee needs to step in more.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I don't feel like there's a downside, to sharing the information. And so I think that the tricky part is it being shared with the HRC for approval or is it being shared with the HRC for information? I feel like there's no downside to sharing with the HRC for information. It's a little bit of a fuzzy line. You're right, Deborah, that PE people, CEOs feel like they're being overstepped if they have to ask for approval. It's nuanced though, to be honest, right? Because like Ryan said, if we already know what we're willing to pay, then there shouldn't be any friction, like we've already said what our philosophy is. We already have these programs, just do that. And where the friction comes in is if you're feeling like you need to do specials.
Well, but then I guess the other added addition is just from a talent perspective, ideally there was already discussions, particularly if it's a termination, there was already hopefully discussions with the HR committee leading up to that decision around, from a talent perspective, we're having issues with this person. And so it's not a surprise. I think that's where it can be more of a concern from the committee's perspective if it's all of a sudden, what, so-and-so, you've made that decision. And so I think that's where the discussion needs to happen, not just for the simple sake of that decision, but it's the lead up so that people understand why it's being made.
It's that integrated talent and pay, because you're like scratching your head because you're like, I thought we liked that person. Didn't we give them an exceeds last time?
Right.
So yes, enough said.
And one thing I was going to weigh in from a governance perspective, you always have in-camera sessions. So some of those things that weren't discussed in the broader group, you can bring them in camera. And those sensitivities sometimes are, the discussions that you want to have in camera. So I'm not here to answer your questions, but I was just weighing in. I know there's some more questions. So thank you, Ryan and Amanda and Alex on that. The next question is, and I think, Alex, you spoke a little bit about this, but please expand on the evolving scope of the HRC. And I think you've talked about that because it's no longer a compensation committee, but how can directors get prepared? And maybe, Alex, do you want to, because I know you talked about preparing as a director and taking that role.
Yeah, well, Ryan mentioned jumping in, which I completely agree with, because the only way you're going to gain more experience is by tackling these topics. But the other thing that came to mind to me was going full circle back to defining the HRC mandate. So ensuring that there is clarity on what is within the HRC's role and responsibility, which will reflect some of the topics that Ryan raised. It also might mean expanding upon the learning and development opportunities. So whether it's external speakers that are coming in to share information to the board, or outside of your existing board, it's attending Women Get on Board webinars and sessions to learn more about evolving topics. And then it also might mean, going back to Amanda's point, looking at your skills matrix and saying when we hire the next director that we're looking for certain skills and experience that we don't currently have but should.
Good. I think those are some, Amanda or Ryan, is there anything else you want to weigh in on?
I would just also just make sure that you take advantage of the time when it's offered, because I think we see often, annually review the HR policies or review the practices, and it's kind of on the mandate, and then it's in a meeting. It's not necessarily covered in detail. I think that's just where you need to sort of use that time to ask the questions.
Great.
And I think that one relates to like the question someone asked about use of AI. So it obviously depends on the type of company you are, but I would absolutely anticipate that if they don't have that in the policies, again, you're overseeing all the policies, so you absolutely should be asking about that. If you have any discomfort with the use of AI in the organization you're working for, they absolutely need to have some policies around that, and you should just ask.
And I know, Amanda, you sort of captured a couple of the questions around culture and development that way and metrics. So maybe I'll go to the next question, because I know we only have so much time. When you've submitted materials to the HRC in advance of a meeting, but there are changes to the materials afterwards, what is the best way to resubmit materials? And should you walk in with them? And Amanda, you talked about Diligent as
yes, a tool.
Yeah.
Yes.
Want to speak to that?
Well, I guess I would first say that sucks, because I don't know if there's a good answer to this question, right? Like nobody likes that. I'd maybe start with like, how do we avoid that? How do we, the all the stuff Alex said is, and the pre-meetings and the pre-reviews and use your advisor, and in order to not, because usually when it's something is changed and you're bringing it in, it's a mistake, to be honest. It's like, oops, I didn't understand something. It's rarely that the world has changed and we hadn't anticipated it, and now it's like a totally different conversation. So I'd say it probably has a little bit to do with the materiality of the change. If it's something minor and there's a typo that can be explained, and you just re-upload it and note it. But it does make board members crazy, because they have their notes in certain places and then there's another version. So it really does depend on significance of the materiality of the change, I would say. I don't know if Ryan or Alex has something to add.
Yeah, I agree with that. If there is an opportunity, certainly flagging it to the committee chair so they're aware. It's not great if they're completely surprised in the meeting, which can occur if you're walking stuff in. And then if there is an opportunity to circulate, whether it's the one page that changed or a paragraph with the change, just so that, again, it's pre-socialized, especially if that topic is for approval versus for discussion. That will influence the urgency.
Okay, maybe I'll continue with the questions, because there's quite a few, which is great. And I see you all pipe up for the next question here. And I know you talked a little bit about it, but here's a specific question. Would also appreciate your insights on the best, or at least evolving practices in HRC's role with respect to workforce changes in technology adoption, particularly Gen AI. Or should I say DeepSeek now?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, but like it does raise, I mean, Amanda, you talked about sort of the policy around even the use of AI, but I think it also then is there's workforce implications that I think as an HR committee you need to understand, right? This gets to sort of the broader mandate around understanding what is the talent strategy in the organization. Are we having to invest in L&D in order to reskill or retrain individuals? Do we anticipate significant layoffs if we are adopting the use of AI? Like there's risks associated with that from a governance perspective and a disclosure perspective. And so I do think this is where it does start to connect, and the board and the HR committee does have a role to play at a high level in understanding what are the risks associated with technology transformation over the next number of years. How are we mitigating it? What are the steps we need to take as an organization?
So
So it's a good,
continued evolution there, right? Like no one size fits all.
yeah.
Yeah, and technology is part of like how you execute your strategy, and then within the Human Resources Committee, how is it impacting the way in which we operate with our humans or not?
Thank you. I'll continue on. I think we've got 5 more minutes and some more questions. So question, do you have an example you can screen share of a talent dashboard, or is it in your toolkit?
I think some of the specific questions are in the toolkit, like some of
Okay.
the things that you can ask for. Yeah.
So hopefully that answers the questions. And
Yeah.
needless to say, without, stating the obvious, if we don't answer the questions and anyone wants to reach out to any one of you on LinkedIn, I'm sure you'd be very happy to hear from them. So just
Yeah.
the obvious, but Alex, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, we mentioned a couple of times, but bringing it to life, this idea of the talent dashboard is awesome because in sort of a very quick summary, you get a sense of what's going on in the organization, and you can, usually the good dashboards give a reference to what happened in the last quarter or the last year. So it's understanding the change. But then what's interesting is even within existing agendas, we have the talent meeting, which is in the summer, and then the compensation meeting, which is in the fall. And so our suggestion is there's opportunities to bring those two together. When you're talking about high performers, understand what the retention holds are from existing long-term incentive plans. Or if we have people that are developing in role, thinking through what are the compensation strategies to encourage people to take on roles that push them and challenge them. So there's more opportunity to bring the talent dashboard and the compensation programs together.
And the culture, there's stuff on that talent dashboard that will indicate, what's happening within the organization, like turnover rates. Why is this happening? Why is this only happening in this one area? So those dashboards they're not just a snapshot of like what's happening. Like you have to ask yourself, why is this happening? I think that they're very good tools to sort of ask good questions, which is what your job is.
Okay, 2 more questions. Hopefully we can get to them. Question, how involved should an HRC be in the hiring of the executive team under the CEO?
I don't know. Should they really even be involved? Right? Like, I think that is something that the CEO needs to sort of be responsible for. I don't think that the board would typically have specific, unless the CEO wants them to, opine on it, or if it's like the CFO and getting the audit committee chair to participate in the process, that might have some involvement, but I don't know, Amanda?
Yeah, the actual hiring of a specific person to fill a specific role, not so much, but more the conversation about how the CEO executes the strategy. We didn't have a digital officer, but now we need a digital officer. Usually you're involved in the articulation of the job description and who that person reports to, and it makes sense it goes right to the CEO. No, it should actually go to the CFO, who has a little bit of expertise in this area. So usually you're involved in the infrastructure around big senior executive roles and why. And then, like Ryan said, you also know what you should know what the compensation associated with that would likely be. You won't know exactly. But you already know. So you know what they're doing and you know about how much they're going to get paid. But the person themselves, I think, is definitely an executive decision.
Okay, this one's a comment and I'll end on it, not unless, I don't know if everyone's reading the chat. Basically, how a CEO attracts and compensates their team is also a great indicator of their overall leadership, not just an expression of a comp model. I don't know if you want to add to that. I don't think it was a question. I think it was a statement.
It's more a brilliant way to close. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
And
No,
you
it
know
is.
where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. I think it's wrapping up all the themes that we talked about today in terms of your job is to hire the best CEO. The job of the CEO is pretty much to do the rest. So, Eric, it's a reflection. It was a reflection on the board, perhaps, how good the CEO is, if it's a reflection of the CEO on who they hire, right? So it's full circle.
Okay, on that note, I just want to thank Ryan, Alex, and Amanda for their tips and tricks and stories on navigating the complexities of the HRC, the Human Resource Committee. Just to let you know, stay tuned. Part 2 is going to be on June 18th, 2025. There'll be a link, follow-up email. We want to thank, on behalf of Women Get on Board, our speakers. We will donate to our charity partner, which is Home Beauty Indigenous Scholarship Fund, for your time today. And we want to thank Southlea Group for being our sponsor for today's Women Get on Board speaker series. Always love the interaction. I love the experience, the passion you all show up with. And Amanda, thank you for introducing your team. That was way better than me. And then just to let you know, following this session, there'll be the slides in the next day or two. The recording will come out, and the link to your toolkit is in the follow-up email. So we just want to thank you all for showing up today. We want to encourage you all to have a phenomenal board journey in 2025. And we'll see Amanda, Ryan, and Alex back on June 18th. But we also have our summit, and we'll see them there as well. So have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you.